The Shadow of Penn's Wolf. Prologue, The Last Cut. Western Pennsylvania, late afternoon, December 20th, 1863. They had been cutting timber along the grade for nearly 3 weeks, long enough that the men had stopped remarking on the cold. The work went on whether the wind cut sharp through the trees or barely moved the occasional flurry of snowflakes. Axes rang. Saws hissed. Teams hauled logs downslope toward the railbed, where ties were stacked and waiting. It was only when the wind died late one afternoon that Foreman Williams noticed how quiet the woods had become. It hadn't happened suddenly. He wasn't sure how long it took for him to notice how empty the air felt. No birds called or dislodged small clumps of snow from the tree branches. No sounds came from any small animals in the snowy brush beyond where the men worked. Williams told himself everything was quieter in the winter, and that the noise and smoke must have driven the local animals off. Satisfied with his explanation, Williams went back to counting the loads. The silence of the woods persisted into the early evening, however, with multiple workmen muttering under their breath as they stole glances at the tree line. All of the men had worked this project for several months now, and the more superstitious among them felt comfortable enough with their peers to spread rumors whenever something out of the ordinary happened. Williams kept an ear out for any rumors that might turn into discontent among the lumbermen, but most uneasiness abated as soon as they chewed through the forest far enough to move their camp. Williams had spent 20 years in logging camps and railroad cuts, and he distrusted any man who blamed hard luck or sloppiness on the supernatural. As the men finished their work for the day, the stillness broke. A long, drawn-out call swelled through the trees before fading back into the quiet. The men had heard howls before, of course. No one worked this close to forested woodland without doing so, and they had actually heard several howls for a few nights running. Nothing close to camp, and nothing that carried over the wind. This call was deeper and rougher than what they had heard before, like the sound was scraping over rusted metal. It made the hairs on Williams's neck stand up, making him adjust his shoulders in an attempt to settle his sudden feeling of unease. Glancing back towards the nearest group of workers, told him he wasn't alone. Wolves, a rough-looking lumberjack said, or dogs gone feral. His fellows didn't appear convinced, but no one offered an alternative explanation. The disappearance of a mule and his handler was noticed near dusk. One of the teamsters failed to return from the tree line with the others, and when Williams went with a group of men to check if the man or mule had gone too injured to come back, they found the foot and hoof prints become drag marks before disappearing into the brush not 50 yards from a cut. The mule was found first as the daylight faded, sprawled on its side down the slope of an embankment with its throat torn open. Wolves took some of the camp's livestock from time to time, especially if the animals panicked and separated from their handlers. But wolves tended to feed wherever they brought their prey down, and this mule had been dragged by the throat through the brush, its limp body and limbs snapping branches and cutting furrows in the dirt. There was no sign of the missing teamster. It was possible that he had gotten lost while chasing after the animal if it had bolted, but how had he wandered from the wide trail the others had followed easily? Williams continued to call for the missing man with the others until the light failed. They were about to turn back when their lanterns swung low over newly scuffed snow and broken branches. One man yelled to the others as he found the missing teamster's cap, flattened, split at the crown, and wet with a dark red blotch that was quickly identified as blood. The search party started to spread out in search of a trail or a body, but found only churned ground leading deeper into the woods. Williams ordered them back as the moon started to rise. They went in a tight group, lanterns held high, voices loud on purpose. Halfway back to camp, something moved with them in the trees, not drawing closer, not retreating, keeping pace. Branches snapped under weight that sounded too heavy for a deer. Once Williams caught sight of something crossing between the uneven tree trunks, a shadow low to the ground, wide shoulders rolling over a long body that narrowed at the hips. When the man next to him shouted and raised his lantern, the shadow was gone. The workers didn't sleep well that night. In the days that followed, they took to their work with a new urgency. Williams slapped down any discussion of the missing teamster, but instituted several new rules that the men were happy to follow. No one went alone. Fires were kept burning through the night. The same strange howl came again once a few days later, but didn't return after that. The strange silence in the woods also did not occur again. By the end of the week, the last ties were stacked, and the men eagerly broke camp in preparation for their move northward. As they pulled out of the clearing where their camp had been, Williams looked back at the cut one last time. In the snow near the stumps, several tracks circled the work site, deep, uneven impressions pressed in and around where the men had labored for weeks. Not prints, not exactly. As if something had paced back and forth outside the camp, waiting for the noise to stop again. Chapter 1. The Dead Cow. Rinsburg, Pennsylvania, early morning, February 4th, 1864. The rest of the herd had gathered along the far fence. One young cow lay alone. The animals tended to huddle together for warmth whenever they were not foraging for yellowed stalks under the light dusting of snow. Anna Godfrey noticed the yearling's odd position first. Only then did she realize the rest of the herd had gathered along the far fence, keeping as much distance from the animal as possible. Sometimes the rest of the herd would avoid an animal that smelled sick, so Anna crossed into the cow pasture to inspect the ostracized bovine before she started on her chores. She found the cow lying on its side not far from the fence, close enough that she could see her house from where she stood. The animal's legs were folded under it as if it had laid down instead of collapsed. As Anna peered closer at the exposed flank, however, the coppery tang of blood filled her nose as she saw a large red stain surrounding the still animal. The hide along the belly and neck had been torn open, the edges darkened where blood had soaked and frozen. Anna crouched and confirmed what she already knew. The cow was dead. Its wide eyes stared blankly forward, a slight ring of frost darkening its lashes. Anna sighed and straightened up as she absently rubbed her hands together to keep warm. Losing an animal happened sometimes, especially among the families who lived in the edge of town. But if a predator had started coming for livestock, the courteous thing to do was to warn her neighbors so they could take precautions. For that, she needed to take another look at the slain animal and try to guess what she was dealing with. The damage was not wild or scattered. The abdomen had been opened and worked at, the soft organs below the ribs gone first, the parts an animal could reach without breaking bone. Anna couldn't tell, but it looked like the lungs and heart had been pulled out through the bottom of the ribs after that. The rest of the body was largely untouched besides a bloody gash on the animal's neck. Anna exhaled slowly. She had seen animals killed by dogs once years ago, when a goat broke through a fence and fled in a panic as a couple of local strays pursued it. That goat had come back in pieces, with bones gnawed and cracked open to get to the marrow. This didn't look like dogs, though, even ignoring the fact that they rarely went after anything as large as a yearling. There was no sign the cow had run. No churned ground, no broken fence rail. Just a wide area pressed flat in the frost on the side of the body where a great weight had settled and shifted. That ruled out wolves as well, as they weren't ambush predators and needed several bodies before they could take down a cow. Maybe a bear had taken the yearling when it had been frozen in fear? Anna stepped around the butchered cow to look at the ground leading from the body to the fence line. At first she didn't see anything, the light blanket of snow appearing undistributed until she looked beyond the fence and towards the woods that abutted next to her property. Near the treeline, the tracks were plain enough once she knew to look for them. They sank deeper than she expected. The impressions looked stretched somehow, as though whatever made them had shifted its weight strangely as it walked. She crouched and peered through the fence to study them, careful not to disturb what she was looking at, then straightened and looked back toward the house again. Smoke was rising from the chimney. The yard lay quiet. From this distance, everything looked as it should have. Shrugging her shoulders, Anna resolved to tell one of her older neighbors what had happened. Maybe the gray hairs on Mrs. Porter's head would allow her to identify whatever had taken the cow. On the walk back towards her barn, a strange memory bubbled up in Anna's mind unprompted. Not exactly what she had just seen, but similar, a long time ago when she was young. Her father and the neighbors had been standing around a carcass hauled out of the forbidden stretch of woods to the north as she looked around the edges of her mother's skirt. The men had spoken in short, practical sentences, as they shifted from foot to foot uneasily. Even with the semi-obstructed view Anna had sneaked before her mother showed her inside. The horse's body had looked wrong in much the same way as this cow today. The belly gutted, the rest of the horse stiffly straight, as if it was an unfinished toy waiting for its torso to be added. But that had been a long time ago. That horse had wandered where it should not have gone. Anna's yearling had not. She reached the gate to the pasture and closed it behind her, latching it with more care than usual. By the time she crossed the yard, she had already settled on what she would mention to Mrs. Porter and the others. Wolves and other predators took livestock in hard winters. Everyone knew that. What troubled her most as she started her chores in the barn was not just the loss of the cow, but the similarities to something that belonged somewhere else. Chapter 1. The Path Beyond the Last Fence. Mid-morning, February 4th, 1864. Johann Boslett took the long way home on purpose. The direct path cut close to the old woods, narrow and rutted, and though it saved time, it had always carried a certain reputation. His grandmother still avoided it. So did most of the older families. Johann had never seen the sense in that. A path was a path. Still, this morning he skirted the fields instead, angling back toward the mill road where he had been working since autumn. He told himself it was because the frost made the shortcut slick. That was true enough. He was halfway along the fence line when he noticed the smell. It was faint, carried on the cold air, but wrong for the time of day. Not rot, too fresh for that, but coppery and heavy, the way the butcher yard smelled before a washdown. Johann slowed, shifting the small cloth bundle of his lunch at his side, eyes scanning the pasture ahead. That was when he saw the marks in the ground. They crossed the path at an angle, not clean tracks, so much as deep impressions pressed hard into the frozen soil, as though something heavy had paused there and shifted its weight. Johann crouched, setting his bundle down carefully beside him. Too large. The teenager measured with his fingers, then frowned and tried again. The shape was wrong for a dog, wrong for any wolf he'd heard described. The spacing didn't fit a horse or a bear either. Not that bears were supposed to range this far south. He straightened, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. The fields lay open around him, pale under the frost, fences standing neat and unbroken. Beyond them, smoke lifted from chimneys, his Aunt Anna's house among them, though he couldn't see her from here. Everything looked ordinary. That was what made the unease harder to dismiss. Johann let out a short breath and shook his head. Tracks, he muttered. That's all. He told himself they were older than they looked, sharpened by the freeze after they were made, or the result of more than one animal crossing over the same place. There were always explanations if you wanted them badly enough. Still, he squashed any curiosity that might have made him follow the tracks further. Instead, he picked up his bundle and stepped over the part of the path where the strange tracks crossed it and continued on, quickening his pace without quite meaning to. The smell clung to him for a few steps and then faded. When he reached the road, he looked back once. The woods stood where they always had, dark beyond the last fence, offering nothing up. Johann went on, annoyed with himself for the tension in his shoulders. He would mention the tracks later, casually, if at all. There was no sense in giving weight to old stories. His parents had grown up with them before they had passed, but they had made a point of teaching Johann to think for himself. And yet, as he walked, a phrase surfaced from memory, something his grandmother used to say. Don't walk where you can't tell what went before you. Chapter 3. Matters of Order. Early evening, February 4th, 1864. Samuel Wright prided himself on keeping things or die merrily. That was not always easy in a town like this. Half its people settled here before he was born, the other half arriving in slow waves since. Old habits lingered, old grudges too, but order, he had learned as mayor, was mostly a matter of listening long enough to know what mattered and ignoring the rest. The first complaint came before noon. A farmer, German long established, stood stiffly in Wright's office and spoke in careful English about a cow taken in the night. Wolves, he said, but not wolves as he understood them. He gestured when he spoke, palms turning up as if the words would not quite land. Wright wrote it down without comment. By mid-afternoon, there were 3 more. A mule missing from the far end of the road. Tracks seen near the north fence. A smell in the fields that lingered too long to be rot. That was when the tone shifted. People stopped asking what would be done and began explaining what it was not. Wolves, yes, but not like this. Dogs, no, not bears. They spoke of weight and quiet and the way the ground looked afterward. Wright listened. He always did. But he had listened to fear before, and it often took familiar shapes. It's been a hard winter, he said more than once. Predators range farther when food is scarce. That was true enough. He had seen it himself. When one man mentioned the old northern woods by name, Wright set his pen down. Let's keep to what we know, he said evenly. Tracks, losses, times. Not stories. The man flushed, but did not argue. Others shifted in their seats. No one pressed a point further, and Wright took that as a small victory. By evening, he had a list long enough to justify action. A night watch was set near the outlying farms. Traps were to be set along the fence lines. Word would be sent to the next town about increased wolf signs. These were all sensible measures. Still, as the room emptied, a faint unease lingered at the back of Wright's mind. Wright stood and looked out the window at the road, at the neat order of buildings and fences that marked the town's edge. Beyond that, the land fell away toward the trees. He told himself it was nothing more than the day's accumulation. Complaints always felt heavier when gathered together. Fear had a way of making itself sound reasonable if enough people spoke at once. He locked his office and stepped outside, drawing his coat tighter against the cold. Behind him, the town settled into its evening rhythms. Ahead, the woods remained dark and unremarkable. Wright walked home convinced he had done what was required. What unsettled him, though he would not have said it aloud, was how often the idea of place had come up, and how many of the complaints turned on the same quiet idea, that things like this were not meant to happen here. Chapter 4. The Night Watch. Late evening, February 5th, 1864. The men set out at dusk because a neighbor had not come home. It was Elias Morrow, returning late from the North Road after helping a relative mend a fence. He was alone, unarmed, and well past the age of wandering foolishly. When his wife came to Wright's home just before sundown, she did not raise her voice. She did not need to, for men volunteered at first, then 6 when word spread, farmers, mill hands, men whose sons were already at war, and who felt the night keenly because of it. Lanterns were trimmed and lit, muskets checked, dogs brought from their yards, and leashed close. Wright stood with them at the road's edge, coat buttoned high, breath fogging the air as he gave instructions. "We go in pairs," he said. "No one goes alone. Keep to the fences and the road. If you hear something, you call it out. If you see anything, you shoot. Simple rules. Sensible ones." Johann stood at the edge of the group, having been told, firmly, that he was too young to join and to stay near the road and keep within sight of the lanterns. He had come because no one had thought to send him away until it was already too late in the day, and because the idea of waiting at home had seemed worse than standing uselessly among men. The men had gathered in front of Anna's home on the north edge of town. Anna stood near the gate to her yard, shawl pulled tight, watching the lanterns move off into the fields without comment. The light did not carry far. Once the watch split and moved out, the night closed in quickly. The fields reflected a pale wash of moonlight, but beyond the fences the ground fell away into shadow. The cold sharpened every sound, the creak of leather, the scuff of boots, but carried nothing back from farther off. For a time, nothing happened. Then, some time after the moon had cleared the trees, a shout came from the north end of the road. Not a cry of pain, too sharp for that, but surprise edged with fear. Lanterns bobbed as men converged, boots slipping in the frost. They found no blood or body, just a stretch of fence pressed flat in one place. The rails bowed and split inward, as if something heavy had pressed against them and then withdrawn. The ground there was torn up, deep impressions churned into the frozen soil. Not a crossing, a turn. One of the men, Matthias Braun the blacksmith, brought a dog forward, coaxing it toward the disturbed earth. The animal lowered its head, sniffed once, and stopped. Its ears flattened. It whined softly and pulled back, planting its feet. When the leash slackened, it did not lunge forward. It bolted the other way, dragging the line from the man's hand and fleeing down the road toward the lights of town. No one laughed. No one said anything at all. They widened the search, voices carrying farther now, calling Elias's name and calling their own positions. Rifles were raised at shadows that did not move. The cold crept in, stiffening fingers and dulling the edge of resolve. Near midnight, a sound reached them. Not close, but not distant either. A low noise drawn out, carrying across the fields from beyond the last fence. It was not quite a howl. It had weight to it, a roughness that set teeth on edge. It faded without echo, leaving the night too quiet in its wake. No one spoke for several seconds. Wright was the first to break the silence. "That's enough," he said. "We hold until dawn. No chasing." No one argued. No one suggested otherwise. By the time the watch broke off its search some time after midnight, Elias Morrow had not been found. And yet, as the men dispersed, a feeling of finality sat deep in the pit of each man's stomach. Elias was gone. Anna watched the lanterns return, one by one. Johann stood where he was told until the last man passed. When the town awoke the next morning, no further damage had been done. No new signs of Elias were found either. What unsettled Wright the most was not what they had heard or failed to see. It was how close the thing had come, and how easily it had slipped away. Chapter 5. The Second Search. Late morning, February 6, 1864. By late morning, the cold had lost its edge, but not its hold. The sun hung low and pale over the fields, bright enough to glare off the frost, but too weak to soften it. The road north of town was crowded in a way it had not been the night before, men moving in wider arcs now, spreading out beyond the fences, calling less and listening more. Elias Morrow had not come home. He had not been found at dawn, nor in the hour after. No blood on the road. No torn coat caught on a rail. Nothing to suggest where he had gone once he left the fence line. The certainty that had settled over the watch during the night had hardened by morning into something quieter and more deliberate. This time they searched farther. Johann had been sent with two of the other older boys to walk the edge of the north pasture, where the ground sloped gently down toward the woods. Their instructions were straightforward and simple. Look for any signs of Elias or where he might have gone. Be careful not to step on any tracks or signs, and call back to the adults if anything seemed amiss. Johann had almost begun to let his thoughts drift when he finally saw something. The snow thinned as the ground fell away, broken by dead grass and patches of frozen earth. Johann was watching his footing when he noticed the place where the frost lay wrong, not scuffed or churned, but pressed flatter than the ground around it, as though something heavy had settled there and shifted. He stopped. A few seconds later, the smell reached him, faint, but unmistakable. Not rot. Not yet. Something sharp and animal, carried thinly on the cold air. Johann swallowed and raised his voice. The men came quickly once he called. They did not hurry, but they did not waste time either, stepping carefully around the disturbed ground, eyes trained downward. Elias lay a short distance beyond, where the slope dipped and the brush thickened. He was on his side, one arm bent beneath him, the other flung forward as if he had tried to crawl. His coat was torn open across the chest and belly, the fabric stiff with frozen blood. Parts of him were gone, the soft places first, taken cleanly enough that the rest of him remained largely intact. His boots were still on his feet. His face, turned partly into the earth, was untouched. No one spoke for a long moment. The body's location undercut some of the hopes that a few of the men had cautiously nurtured in their hearts. The body was beyond the fences, beyond the road, past the places a man might reasonably wander after dark. Elias would not have come this far from the road alone, and in the half-light of lanterns and exhaustion, the ground here would have swallowed him whole when his neighbors had searched for him. One man, Jacob Heller the miller, crossed himself. A young farmer named Thomas Reed turned away to retch. The dogs would still not come any farther than the fence line. Anna heard the voices before she saw them. She had come north to check her far fence, the one nearest the pasture, uneasy enough that the chores at home had been left half done. When the sound reached her, men calling to one another in short, careful bursts, she followed it without thinking. They were already standing back when she reached the edge of a clearing. She did not need to be told what they had found. The men shifted as she approached, not barring her way, but not making room either. They all stood in a wide circle, as if worried about being too close to the body. She stopped where the ground rose, looking down at the still form below. The damage was plain enough from a distance. What struck her most was not the violence of it, but the restraint, the way the body had not been torn apart, the way so much had been left behind. Johann stood off to one side, pale and silent, his hands clenched at his sides. He did not look up as Anna joined them. He did not move when she placed a reassuring hand on her nephew's shoulder. Wright arrived last. He took in the scene without comment, eyes moving from the body to the slope, to the thin line of trees beyond. He didn't kneel to inspect the body. He just drank in all of the scene before him for a moment. Nothing moved him after death then? You didn't see anything that meant he had been dragged from a road afterwards? Wright asked finally. No, one of the men, a tall shopkeeper named Isaac Porter, answered. There's nothing between here and the road. No boot prints, no blood. It took him from the road without dragging him through the frost. Wright nodded once. That, more than anything else, explained the night. They covered Elias as best they could before carrying him back. No one talked about how or why. The questions would come later, when there was time and distance enough to speak them aloud. As they turned away, Johann glanced once more at the pressed ground behind them, the place where the frost lay flat and disturbed, and then forced himself to look ahead. As the group crossed the fence and the road, Johann expected to feel some of the heaviness in the air lighten. It didn't. The pressure stayed with them. Chapter 6. What is said aloud. Midday, February 6, 1864. The men returned Elias Morrow to his house just after noon. They did not carry him through the front door. Instead, they set the stretcher down in the yard, beneath the bare branches of the old apple tree where his children had played in warmer months. Frost still clung to the grass in the tree's shadow, unbroken except where their boots pressed it flat. Braun the blacksmith brought another blanket and drew it higher, careful and deliberate, as though modesty still mattered. Isaac the shopkeeper went inside to fetch Elias's wife. No one tried to explain. There was nothing left to say that she did not already know. When she came out, the yard was quiet. The men stood back, hats in their hands, eyes lowered. The house behind her felt suddenly too small, the land around it too wide and exposed. Winter light filtered through the branches overhead, cold and indifferent, and the apple tree gave no shelter at all. By the time the bell was rung to call the town together, word had spread ahead of it. They gathered in the meeting house, coats left on, hats in hands or pressed low over brows. The stove had been lit, but the room still held the cold. Breath fogged faintly as people spoke, then quieted again. Children were sent home or set to the back benches with the older girls. Dogs were tied outside. Wright stood at the front with his hands resting on the back of a chair. He waited until the room settled before he spoke. Elias Morrow was found this morning, he said, north of the road, beyond the fence. A murmur moved through the room, low and contained. He did not wander there on his own, Wright continued. There were no signs of a struggle along the road. No tracks leading away. Whatever took him did so quickly. He did not say what had taken Elias. He did not need to. The space he left was enough. A man near the stove, Samuel Pike the carpenter, cleared his throat. Wolves, he said. Not loudly. Just enough to be heard. It's been a hard winter. They range farther when the deer thin out. Several heads nodded at once. Relief flickered across a few faces, thin but genuine. Wolves leave sign, Jacob the miller said, slower. They rip and tear and drag. They hunt in numbers, a large burly man named Wilhelm added. You'd hear them. Wright let the discussion run for a moment before lifting his hand. There are no wolves that eat like that, he said evenly, and none that lift a grown man clear of frozen ground without leaving a mark. That quieted them again. Johann sat with his hands folded between his knees, staring at the floorboards. He had not intended to come. His grandmother Boslet had told him to stay home. But when the bell rang, his feet had carried him here all the same. Across the aisle, Anna stood with the other women near the wall. She had not meant to speak. She knew better than to try. Still, when one of the men laughed, briefly, nervously, and said something about bears, the sound turned her stomach. "There hasn't been a bear sighted this close to town in years," she said before she could stop herself. The room stilled. A few men turned to look at her, not unkindly, but not welcoming either. "They don't hunt like that," she went on, quieter now. "Not in the cold. Not without tearing more apart." Wright met her eyes and inclined his head just slightly. An acknowledgement, not an invitation. From the back bench, an older German man that even the Anglo townsfolk called Vogel spoke, not loudly, but with the confidence of someone used to being heard. "There are old rules," he said, "for places like this." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Wright did not interrupt him, but several others did. "This isn't the old country. We don't need stories. We're not children." Vogel held up his hands, palms out. "I am not saying what it is," he said. "Only that the woods remember things longer than we do." That was enough. Someone laughed again, sharper this time. Wright stepped forward before the argument could take shape. "We're not settling causes today," he said. "We're settling what we do next." That, at least, they could agree on. The watch would continue. Fences would be checked and mended. No one would walk alone after dark. Children would be kept close. Dogs would be brought inside at night. Reasonable things. Sensible things. As the meeting broke apart, Johann rose slowly. He felt no comfort in the plans they had made, only the weight of what had not been said. Near the door, he heard his grandmother's voice again, clear as if she were standing beside him. "Don't walk where you can't tell what went before you." Outside, the light was already thinning. Chapter 7. Doorstep. Around midnight, February 9th, 1864. For several nights after the meeting, nothing else was taken. The new rules were followed carefully. Not easily, not comfortably, but with attention. Lanterns were kept close. Doors were barred before dusk. Dogs were brought inside or tied nearer to the house than before. Men walked in pairs when they had to walk at all. Children were watched more closely. Heads counted when they came in from chores. It felt, to some, like progress. Anna found herself listening more than she used to, pausing before stepping outside, gauging the air, the quiet. She did not go past the far fence after sundown. Johann did not either. When he came by in the evenings to help with the heavier work, he stayed until the light was about to fail, and then went home with a lantern swinging at his side. No one said it aloud, but there was a sense that if they did these things properly, if they respected the boundary as it now stood, the danger would remain beyond it. The night the dog was taken was cold enough to crack the water bucket by morning. It was the Hellers' place, close to the center of town. Too close for comfort, as people would say afterward. Their yard sat tight against the road, fence low and well kept, the house solid and square behind it. The dog, a broad-chested farm brute, more bark than sense, had been chained near the porch as always, iron links fixed to a stake driven deep beside the step. The Hellers had gone to bed early. The lamps were out. The road lay empty. No one heard the first sound. Later, neighbors would argue about whether there had been a cry, a bark cut short, perhaps, or the scrape of metal on stone. But if there was, it did not wake anyone in time. What did wake them was the noise that followed. A crash, sharp and sudden, wood splitting, iron shrieking as something wrenched it free. The sound carried down the road, loud enough that doors opened and lanterns flared to life almost at once. Johann was already awake when the shouting began. He pulled on his coat and boots and followed the light spilling into the street, heart pounding not with confusion but with recognition. He knew before he reached the Hellers' house that whatever they would find there would not fit the rules they had made. Not anymore. The chain lay torn from the ground, the stake wrenched loose and flung several feet from where it had been set. The earth around it was churned and broken. Frozen clods split apart as if pried open by force. One porch rail had cracked where something heavy had struck it hard enough to leave a dark smear. There was blood. Not much. Just enough to mark the place. The dog was gone. Men stood at the edge of the yard with lanterns held high, faces pale and tight. No one crossed the threshold at first. It was Wright who stepped forward, careful, deliberate, his boots crunching softly as he moved. He looked up into the pale faces of both Jacob and his wife, who stood in the doorway, each holding a child close. Both adults looked almost sick, like something precious had been violated in addition to losing the family pet. The chain lay coiled where it had fallen. One link twisted open, metal stretched, and bent rather than broken cleanly. Wright crouched to examine it, but did not touch it. It took the dog. Wilhelm, the woodsman said, tried to take the same way. Johann swallowed. He could picture it too, easily. The sudden rush, the weight, the pull. The animal doing what it always did, not knowing the ground would not give. But iron and frost had not been enough to save the dog. Anna stood near the back of a small crowd, arms folded tight against her chest. She had not meant to come, but the sound had carried to her house, and once awake, she could not sit still. She took in the broken stake, the blood dark against the frost, the nearness of it all. It didn't care where it was, she said quietly. Several heads turned. Not toward her exactly, toward the truth of what she'd said. Wright straightened slowly. No, he agreed. It didn't. That was when the tone changed. Not fear. Fear had been there already. This was something harder, sharper. The understanding that what they had been doing was not enough. That the boundary they had drawn was one the thing in the woods did not recognize. We can't wait for it to come again, Isaac Porter said. Next time it won't be a dog. Others nodded. Several adults began to talk over one another in quick, anxious bursts. Wright raised a hand, but he did not quiet them at once. We wait until daylight, he said finally. We get organized. No one goes charging into the woods alone. But even as he spoke, Johann felt it, the shift beneath the careful language. The town had stopped thinking about how to keep the danger out. Now they were thinking about how to go after it. As the crowd began to break apart, Johann lingered at the edge of the yard. His eyes kept returning to the torn earth where the chain had been anchored, the place where effort had met resistance and been overcome. Whatever rules they had made, Johann understood now that whatever had come for the Heller's dog did not recognize them at all. It hunted where the food was. And it would come again. Chapter 8. The First Shot. Late morning, February 10th, 1864. They left the road behind before noon. At first the land looked no different than it had closer to town. Same trees, same cold light slanting through bare branches. But after another half hour of walking, the change became harder to ignore. The woods thickened. Not taller, but denser. Underbrush crowded in where it should have been grazed down. Thorn and sapling knitting together in a way that made progress slow and noisy. The game trails were wrong. They were there, but faint, threads rather than paths. Places where something had passed once or twice and not returned. No clean runs pressed into the earth, no churned crossings at the creeks. Wright noticed it before he knew why it bothered him. He had followed deer often enough to recognize when the ground no longer remembered them. Too quiet, someone muttered. They spread out slightly as planned. Not far, no more than a few paces between men, but enough to see past one another, enough to keep from walking blind. Rifles were held ready now, not slung. The dogs had been left behind. They found sign near a shallow ravine where the ground dipped and rose again into thicker brush. Pressed earth. Broken stems. A place where something heavy had passed and circled, restless. Wright raised a hand. They stopped. The silence here was different than it had been near the farms. There was no distant crow call, no rustle of small movement in the leaves. Even the wind seemed to slide over the place without settling. Wright felt it then, not fear exactly, but the sense of being watched from somewhere close and low. He slowed, every step deliberate, eyes moving over shadow and brush. That was when it came, not from ahead, but from the side. It burst from the undergrowth in a rush of motion and weight, so fast that the lanky farmhand it hit barely had time to cry out. The creature struck him high, shoulder and chest, claws clamping down as it drove him backward off his feet. The sound was not a roar, Not a howl, just the wet impact of breath knocked loose, and the sharp crack of bodies colliding. It tried to take him. That was clear in the way it wrenched, hauling the man toward the ravine, muscles bunched and driving. This was the same movement it had used before, the same snatch and carry that had worked so cleanly in the dark. But this time, the woods answered back. A rifle went off at arm's length. The shot was wild, deafening. The flash bright enough to bleach the trees white for an instant. Another followed, closer, lower, hitting the monster's side with an audible crack. The creature recoiled with a sound that was part breath, part fury, releasing its grip as the man beneath it screamed and scrabbled backward. The third shot struck the creature's upper arm. Wright did not see the bullet hit, only the way the creature lurched, its movement breaking apart into something uneven and wrong. It staggered, claws tearing at the frozen ground as it turned, blood darkening the fur along its arm and flank. Then it was gone, not fleeing cleanly, not vanishing like a shadow, but crashing away through the brush, snapping branches and leaving a trail that even an untrained eye could follow. The sound of its passage faded unevenly, marked by a final, hoarse noise that carried farther than it should have. Silence rushed back in behind it. For a moment, no one moved. The farmhand, a brown-haired man named Adams, lay on his side, gasping, hands clutched tight in his coat. Blood seeped through his sleeve and along his ribs, bright against the frost. Wright was with him at once, voice low and steady, hands already pressing and binding. The other men stood where they were, heart hammering, staring at the torn ground where the creature had stood, the pressed earth, the broken stems, the place where it had hesitated, where hunger had met resistance and failed. "It tried to hunt us," Pike the carpenter said. "No," Wright answered without looking up. "It tried to hunt one man." That difference mattered. They did not pursue it. Not yet. But as they turned back toward the road, carrying the wounded Adams with them, Wright glanced once more into the ravine. The faint trail vanished quickly into the thickened growth, swallowed by brush that had not been trampled in a long time. The woods had not always been like this. Something had been pushed here, and now it had been hurt. Chapter 9. Injured. Late evening, February 10th, 1864. The sound carried farther than it should have. It came just after dusk, when the town was settling into the new habits it had learned too quickly. Doors barred, lamps trimmed low, voices kept inside. A single, rough cry rolled out of the north and then cut off abruptly, as if the breath behind it had failed. It was not a howl. Anna was ladling stew when she froze, hand suspended over the pot. Johann, seated at the table with his coat still on, looked up at the same instant. They did not speak. The sound came again, closer this time, shorter, broken. There was a rasp beneath it, something strained and ugly, gone almost as soon as it was heard. By the time the bell was rung, people were already in the street. They found the sheep near the mill pond, not 20 yards from the last house on the road. It lay half in the reeds, water darkened around it, the ground torn up in a wide, careless circle. The kill was wrong in a way Johann recognized immediately. Too much damage, too much effort. The animal had been taken quickly, its throat crushed, neck broken, but the feeding had been uneven. Great chunks torn away and then abandoned. The body dragged, then dropped, then dragged again for only a few paces more. Blood splashed farther than it needed to be, marking a path that doubled back on itself before disappearing into the brush. It didn't finish, Braun the blacksmith said. Wright crouched near the body, lantern held low. He did not touch it. It couldn't, he said after a moment. Or wouldn't. The tracks told the rest of the story. They cut deep and staggered, spacing uneven, one side biting harder into the ground than the other. The trail wove where it should have been straight, circled once as if the creature had lost its balance or footing, then plunged north again without care for cover or concealment. It had crossed open ground to get here. That was new. "It's hurting," Thomas Reed said, voice tight. "It's getting clumsy." "Yes," Wright said. "And now it's hungry." The next night it came again. This time it took a calf from a fenced lot, snapping the rail outright rather than finding a gap. The struggle had been loud and clumsy, with breaking, the calf's brief, terrible bellow, the crash of bodies against the fence. The animal was dragged only a short distance before being dropped, unfinished, as if the effort itself had become unbearable. Men arrived with lanterns while the echoes were still fading. They saw nothing moving, only the damage left behind. By the third night, it did not take livestock at all. It came close enough to brush a porch rail and leave a smear of blood along the post, its blood this time dark and thick, rubbed there as if by accident rather than intent. A visible trail led from one house to another, but never committing to any of them. A woman swore she had heard breathing just beyond the wall. Too heavy, too near. That was when fear turned sharp. Not panicked, focused. Wright doubled the patrols. Fires were kept lit through the night at the edges of town. Men slept in shifts with rifles across their knees. No one walked without light. No one walked alone. And still, Johann lay awake listening, counting the sounds that did not come. What troubled him most was not where the creature went, but how it moved now. It no longer hunted like something that knew its ground. It struck too close, stayed too long, fled too quickly. It wasted strength where once it had conserved it, left food behind not from caution, but from inability, like an animal that could not afford to be patient anymore. On the fourth evening, Johann found Anna standing at the edge of her yard, staring north. "You shouldn't be out," he said gently. She did not turn. "It's not thinking anymore," she said. "Not the way it was." Johann followed her gaze toward the dark beyond the fences, toward the woods that had been avoided for generations, and then, recently, disturbed. Wounded things did not always retreat. Sometimes they lashed out. Sometimes they went back to where they had first felt safe. Johann did not say what had already begun to take shape in his mind. But when he went home that night, he packed his knife and his lantern and did not put them away. Chapter 10. The Near Place. Late evening, February 13th, 1864. It came back to Anna's place the night after the tracks were found between the houses. Not with speed. Not with silence. Johann was already inside when the dogs began to stir, not barking, not howling, but pacing their tethers with low, unsettled whines that rose and fell without finding shape. He looked up from the table at the same moment Anna paused near the hearth, both of them listening to the same wrongness pressing in from outside. The air felt held. Johann moved to the window, but did not open it. He lifted the lantern instead, letting its light spill across the glass. Frost glittered back at him, unbroken near the house, but farther out, near the barn, something had disturbed the ground. A broad path pressed down through the grass, curving along the fence line before doubling back on itself. It had already been there a while. From the barn came a sudden clatter, which struck from the outside, not hard enough to break, but hard enough to rattle the frame. A goat bleated sharply, then again, the sound high and panicked. Johann's hand tightened around the lantern handle. Another thud followed, heavier this time, and then a scraping sound along the lower boards, slow and uneven. Not tearing, not charging, testing. "It's at the barn," Johann said quietly. Anna nodded once. She had gone pale, but her voice was steady. "They're inside. The doors are barred." The scraping stopped. For a moment there was only the sound of rough breathing, close enough now that Johann could hear the hitch in it, a wet, uneven rasp that dragged in and out as if the air itself were difficult to hold. The smell reached them a heartbeat later, seeping through the cracks around the door, old blood, iron, and something animal beneath it, rank and cold. Then the shape moved. The lantern light caught it only in pieces, the press of frost flattening under weight, the shadow of a shoulder sliding along the barn wall, the way it favored one side as it stepped. It circled once, wide and uncertain, then drifted away from the barn entirely, toward the house. Johann's breath slowed, every sense narrowing. He did not move. Neither did Anna. They stood in the center of the room, listening as something passed close enough outside that the dogs fell silent altogether. Sniffing, slow, deliberate, the sound of a nose drawing in scent along the ground, along the wall, lingering near the doorframe where human hands had touched wood 100 times that day. The shape paused there longer than anywhere else. Johann felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. It wasn't choosing a building. It was choosing a place. A lantern flared at the edge of the lane. Then another. Shouts followed, men calling to one another, boots striking frozen ground. The scrape of metal as a rifle was brought up too quickly, and then steadied. The light spread and broke the dark into pieces. The breathing outside changed. For a long, dangerous second, the shape did not retreat. It shifted its weight instead, shoulders rising, chest expanding with a sound that scraped raw out of its throat. Not a howl, not a cry, but something hoarse and defiant, as if it were deciding whether the cost was still worth paying. Then it moved. Not fast. Not clean. The frost parted again under uneven steps, the trail dragging north, back toward the woods. The smell lingered longer than the sound did. By the time Wright arrived, lantern held low, the yard was full of light and voices. The barn stood. The goats were alive. The house was untouched. But the marks were everywhere. Dirt and snow was smeared along the lower fence rail. The boards beneath the barn door were scored at two different heights where something had scraped at them. The tracks circled the house twice before pulling away. "It came back," Wright said. "Yes," Johann answered. "And it stayed." Wright studied the ground for a long moment. "It didn't eat." "No, that makes 2 nights." The men spoke quietly after that. Watches were doubled. Fires built closer to the houses. Someone volunteered to stay with Anna until dawn. Still, Johann felt no easing of the weight in his chest. This had not been a hunt. It had been a decision delayed. When he finally left Anna's house, lantern held tight against the cold. Johann looked north toward the dark stretch of woods that had once been avoided out of habit and memory. If it was willing to come this close while wounded, if hunger had begun to outweigh fear, then waiting for it to fail again was no longer an option. Somewhere beyond the fences, beyond the road, there was a place it returned to when it could no longer decide. And Johann knew, with a clarity that frightened him, that if no one went looking for it, it would come back and finish choosing. Chapter 11. Old Ground. Mid-morning, February 14th, 1864. By mid-morning, the frost had burned off the fields, but the ground near the north fence was still torn. Johann found it while helping his grandmother Boslet carry water. The bucket sloshed against his leg as he stopped short, eyes fixed on the churned earth just beyond the last post. Something had crossed there recently, not last night, but not long ago either. The grass was bent and broken, pressed down in a looping, uncertain pattern that did not match any animal trail he knew. There were marks where it had paused, where it had turned back on itself, and there, dark against the pale soil, was a slight trace of blood. Not much, but fresh. Grandmother Boslet saw his face and followed his gaze. She did not ask him what it was. She only said, "Leave it," and turned back toward the house. Johann did not answer. By the time he crossed the fence, the sun was high enough to thin the mist between the trees, but the woods swallowed light all the same. This was older ground, avoided ground. Even before the logging, before the rails, people had learned not to linger here. The paths were wrong. Game trails that should have been worn smooth were choked with undergrowth, while other stretches lay strangely bare, as if nothing living passed through them anymore. He moved slowly, following what he could. The trail was not clean. It appeared in fits and starts, a scuffed patch of leaves, a snapped sapling, the deep press of weight where something had stopped too suddenly. More blood marked the way now, smeared along bark and stone at a height that made his stomach tighten. Whatever had made it was not moving easily. Once he lost the trail entirely and had to circle back. When he found it again, it had doubled over itself, looping as if the creature had not known which way to go. The ground there was trampled hard, leaves ground to pulp, the earth beneath gouged by uneven force. Johann stood there longer than he meant to. This was not hunting sign. It was pain. The cabin came into view all at once. It sat in a small clearing where the trees drew back reluctantly, roof sagging, walls dark with age and weather. One corner had collapsed inward. The door hung crooked on one hinge, the wood around it chewed and scarred as if by years of rough use, or something worse. Moss had crept up the stones of the hearth. The place had not been lived in for a long time, but something had come back to it. The smell hit him first, old rot layered with something sharp and animal. He heard movement then, low and heavy, just inside the tree line, beyond the cabin. Johann did not see it at first. He saw the shape of it. It stood taller than a man when it rose. Shoulders hunched forward, as if the weight of its own body pulled it down. Its outline was wrong, too long in the arms, too narrow at the waist, the head thrust forward on a thick neck that did not turn so much as follow the body. Fur clung to it in uneven patches, matted dark along one side where blood had soaked and dried. When it moved, it favored one forelimb, holding it close, the shoulder stiff and trembling with each step. Its breathing was loud now, a wet rasp that hitched when it shifted its weight. It turned its head toward him. The face was unmistakably lupine in its shape, the length of the muzzle, the set of the jaw, but stretched into something heavier, more deliberate. Teeth showed as it drew breath, not in a snarl at first, but as if the motion itself hurt. Johann did not remember raising the lantern. He only remembered the sound it made as it swung in a grip when the creature lunged. It was fast despite the injury, a sudden, brutal burst of motion. It struck him hard, the weight of it driving him back into the ground. Pain flared white-hot along his side as claws raked, not cleanly, but with clumsy force. He felt teeth scrape fabric, then flesh, a tearing pull that did not quite find his hold. The creature snarled, not in triumph, but in frustration, and reared back as Johann screamed and kicked, the lantern smashing against its shoulder. The light flared, and in that instant Johann saw the wound clearly, the torn flesh beneath the fur, the swelling beneath it, the way the limb refused to bear weight. The creature hesitated, just for a breath. Then it turned. It did not pursue him as he scrambled back, half blind with pain, dragging himself away from the clearing. Instead, it wheeled toward the cabin, toward the shadowed space behind it, where something lay half hidden in the brush, a dark shape already torn open, already claimed. Food. It dropped its head and fed, quick and desperate, tearing without care. Johann did not wait to see more. He ran until the woods thinned and the fences rose again, until voices reached him and hands caught him before he fell. Behind him, deep in the old ground, the sound of feeding carried, short, ugly, and urgent. The creature had a home worth protecting, and it would not leave it easily again. Chapter 12. The Unnamed Place. Mid-morning, February 15th, 1864. Johann woke to the sound of wind moving through the eaves. Not the sharp cry that had torn him out of sleep the night before, not the frantic pounding of feet or the shout of his name, just wind, steady and patient, worrying at the corners of the house as if it had all the time in the world. Somewhere beyond the walls, a horse stamped once in its stall. Chickens rustled, unsettled but alive. His chest burned when he tried to sit up. "Don't," his grandmother said immediately, her voice close. "Lie still." She was seated beside the bed, shawl pulled tight despite the fire burning low in the hearth. Her hands, gnarled but steady and sure, rested on the blanket as if to keep him anchored to it. The bandage beneath his shirt pulled when he breathed too deeply, a reminder that the pain was not a dream, that the woods and the cabin and the thing that had come out of the dark were all real. The room smelled of boiled cloth and old herbs. Not healing, just cleanliness, care. He was not alone. Wright stood near the table, hat in his hands. Anna leaned against the far wall, arms folded tight across herself, eyes rimmed red but dry. Several other men and a woman were there as well, older, all of them. Settlers who had been in the valley longer than Wright, longer than Johann had been alive. They did not speak. They did not meet his eyes. Wright stirred and said, "We hate to intrude when you need rest, Johann, but we need to know what happened and how you got injured." Johann nodded and attempted to sit up only for his skin under the bandages to flare with pain. His grandmother steadied his head as he reclined back into his pillow before beginning to speak. He told it plainly. The ruined cabin. The way the creature did not pursue once he fell back. How it placed itself between him and the tree line, not advancing, not retreating. How it circled when he moved, as if guarding a boundary rather than hunting prey. Johann did not dress it up. He did not reach for words like mercy. He describes what he saw in shallow, pained phrases. When he is done, the room stayed quiet longer than was comfortable. Outside, the wind rose and fell. A dog barked once from somewhere down the road, then went quiet. The ordinary sounds of morning pressed in around the house, almost aggressively normal. Wright leaned forward at the table, fingers steepled, eyes not on Johann, but on the older men and woman along the walls. He has the uneasy sense that the testimony was not meant for him at all, that Johann has spoken into a depth that predated both of them. Anna broke the silence first, hesitant. "My grandmother used to tell a story," she said. "Not a story for children. One she only told when she thought no one else was listening. About a man who would not leave his land, even after he'd no right to it anymore. Said he lived rough. Said the woods took him back." No one answered her at first. The fire popped softly. Wind slid along the shutters, carrying with it the distant creak of a wagon axle. Someone starting their day, as if nothing had changed. One of the elders, Vogel, old enough that his accent thickened whenever he was tired, let out a slow breath. "It wasn't a story," he said. "We know what it was," he continued. "And we know why it stays where it does." That landed harder than an accusation. Grandmother Boslitz's hand tightened on the blanket. She did not look at Johann when she spoke, but at the men standing in her house, at the ones who had chosen silence year after year. "If you're going to keep this from him," she said quietly, "you should have kept him safe." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Vogel bowed his head. A man older than Vogel, called Old Man Weber, crossed himself without thinking. Vogel looked at Wright, measuring him. "You came later, after the rules were already rules." Wright did not bristle. He only nodded. "Then tell me what they were built on." Another elder spoke before Vogel can answer. The Anglo matriarch Mrs. Porter, whose family name appears in the first ledger entries after the settlement line goes from German script to English. "We knew," she said quietly. "Those of us who were here long enough to learn the shape of the problem." Weber spoke up again, his glasses shining in the lantern light. "His name was Matthias Kruger," he said. "He came over before most of us, trapped north of the river, farther than anyone else wanted to go. He was wrong even then, not mad, just empty." He glanced once at Johann's bandaged arm. People went missing. Not often, but it didn't stop. Anna's hand tightened on the mantel. "At first we blamed the woods, weather, wolves, bad luck. Then we stopped naming it at all." Weber's mouth twisted bitterly. "Because Matthias wasn't Matthias anymore. He was something else." Johann's hands tightened in his lap, and he painfully raised himself up onto one elbow. Johann started to speak, then stopped, jaw tightening, as if the words hurt worse than the bandages. A look from his grandmother silenced him before he could force them out. "We tried once to put a stop to it," Vogel said, "before there were enough of us to call it a town, before we were careful about which language we prayed in." Vogel shifted his weight before continuing. "We tried to kill whatever Matthias had become. We shot at him, set out traps, poisoned his well." Old Man Weber shook his head sadly and said, "It didn't work and we lost good men trying," he said. "All we accomplished was learning how many holes you can have in your heart and still breathe." The wind pushed harder against the shutters, as if in response. "So you made rules," Wright said after a moment. "We made boundaries," Vogel corrected him. "Places not to go, times not to linger, things not to build. And when those weren't enough," Wright asked. "They were enough," Mrs. Porter said. "For most." The word hangs there. "We couldn't stop it," Vogel said after a moment. "We waited for it to starve, or rot, or fade into the woods and become someone else's problem." His voice hardened. It didn't. Wright looked back to Johann then, bandaged, pale, trying very hard not to let his anger show. "We weren't meant to learn it this way," Wright said. "It is not an apology, but it is not a dismissal either." Old Man Weber's voice had a slight quaver as he said, "We knew it wouldn't simply go away. That's what we never said out loud. It was easier to live beside it than to lose more sons trying to finish what couldn't be finished." Another awkward silence hung in the air before Johann spoke. "It's protecting that place," Johann said quietly, "like it's the only ground it knows." Wright considered that sentence a moment before straightening. "Then we stop pretending the rules are enough," he said. Grandmother Boslett gently pushed against Johann's chest to force him to lie down again. She looked up at the men and women in her home and adds, "And we don't send boys where men should go." The elders do not answer immediately, but none of them disagreed. And in the lantern light, that was enough. Chapter 13. The Homecoming. Midday, February 16th, 1864. The wagon came in just before noon. Someone called out from the far end of the road, and Wright turned in time to see it roll into view between the houses, slow, careful, drawn by a patient horse and driven by a man Wright did not recognize. The wagon bore no cargo worth noting. What it carried sat upright despite the ruts, one hand braced against the rail as if balance had become a skill rather than a given. Anna saw him first. She did not hesitate. The moment recognition struck, she broke into a run. "John." The man looked up at the sound of his name, and whatever reserve he had been holding shattered. He awkwardly slid down the side of the wagon as the man driving it pulled the reins sharply to bring the horse to a stop. John Godfrey leaned against the wagon and opened his arms just as his wife reached the wagon, and Anna hit him hard enough that his breath went out in a sharp, involuntary sound. His good foot slid. His injured side failed him. "Anna, wait." He might have gone down if the driver hadn't reached over to offer a steadying hand on John's back, and if John hadn't twisted at the last moment, shifting his weight more onto the wagon. Anna did not let go. She buried her face against his chest, fingers clenched in the dark wool of his uniform as if she could anchor him there by force alone. "I thought," she began and could not finish. "I know," he said quietly, one arm locked around her, the other gripping the wagon rail. "I know." Wright stepped forward then, close enough to see the damage clearly. John Godfrey wore the blue still, though it hung looser than it should have. His leg, right hip, Wright guessed, was stiff with the careful posture of someone who had learned pain the hard way. His face was thinner, older somehow, the eyes sharp and measuring even as he held his wife. "I came as soon as they'd let me," John said. "A farmer near the rail stop gave me the lift." He gestured up at the wagon driver, who inclined his head politely. "Ferdinand here said it was better than leaving me to hobble the rest of the way." "Why are you home?" Pike the carpenter asked. Not unkindly. John's mouth twisted. "They said I was lucky." No one pressed him. Anna helped him away from the wagon with care, her arm firm around his waist, while Braun the blacksmith grabbed John's pack from the back of the wagon. Ferdinand gave a half wave in John's direction and urged his horse forward towards the edge of town. John's right boot shook slightly every time it touched the ground, as if it needed to test his weight each time before committing. John leaned against the wall of the nearest building with one hand, putting most of his weight on his left leg as if confirming a known limitation. John glanced around the town he knew so well and was slightly surprised to see no children playing outside. All the dogs that would normally be barking at the arrival of a strange wagon had contented themselves with some subdued noises from behind wooden fences. "What happened here?" he asked. The question was calm, professional, the voice of a man who had learned how to ask it when the answer might be bad. Wright met his eyes. "We should talk inside." That alone told John enough to follow without argument. Johann's house felt smaller than it had that morning. Johann lay propped against pillows, his skin pale but his eyes alert. Grandmother Boslett sat close beside him, hands busy with folded cloth, her presence steady and immovable as a piece of old furniture that had always belonged there. John took in the room in a single sweep bandages, drawn faces, too many elders for an ordinary visit. His gaze paused on Johann last. "You're hurt," he said. "Yes," Johann replied. John nodded once. He did not ask how. Wright told it then, plainly and without embellishment. The cabin, the behavior, the way the creature had placed itself between Johann and the woods, as if guarding something rather than pursuing prey. John listened without interruption. When Wright finished, the room remained quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, bringing with it the ordinary sounds of the valley at work, wood splitting a distant hammer, the creak of a wagon axle. Life continuing, stubborn and unaware. John exhaled slowly. "So it isn't leaving." "No," Old Man Weber said. "It never was going to." John's eyes shifted to the older faces along the wall. And you've known? Yes, Mrs. Porter answered. Those of us who were here early enough. John absorbed that. Then, and the rules. They kept us alive, Vogel said carefully. Not safe. Alive. John turned back to write. Then, we stop hoping time will finish it for us. That landed cleanly. What do we have to work with? He asked. Rifles. Jacob, the miller, offered. John shook his head. Not enough. Not like this. Grandmother Boslett spoke without looking up from her hands. Old Marta planted things others wouldn't, she said. Said there were fences you couldn't see. Vogel closed his eyes behind his glasses and spoke. Wolfsbane. John glanced at Wright. Does it work? It was never tested properly, Vogel replied. John nodded. And silver. A longer silence this time. There's still a couple pieces in a church, Porter said at last. Somewhere. John leaned back slightly, weight careful over his injured hip. Then we prepare. Out loud. Together. His eyes found Johann again. You did what you could, he said. Now we do the rest. Chapter 14. The Plan. Early evening, February 16, 1864. They gathered in the long room of the church vestry, not because it was sacred, but because it was the only space large enough to hold them all and still close the door. Lanterns were set low along the walls. Rifles leaned in careful rows beside the benches, barrels dark. Several bayonets catching the light where they'd been newly fitted. Outside, the afternoon wind pressed against the building in uneven gusts, carrying with it the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke from the hearths beginning to wake across town. John Godfrey stood with his weight braced against the edge of the table, injured hip kept carefully back. He did not sit. He never sat when there was work to be done. Vogel spread a rough map across the table, not inked, not measured, but scratched charcoal in memory. The creek bend, the ravine north of the old trapper's cabin, the slope where the trees grew too tight for a clean line of sight. This is where it will break cover, Vogel said, tapping once with a knuckle. If it leaves the cabin as it did before. If, Wright said. Vogel met his eyes. It will. It cannot stay with fire in its lungs. That was the fulcrum the room turned on. Grandmother Boslett sat near the wall, shawl folded tight around her shoulders. She did not rise, but her voice carried. Old Marta's plants still grow, she said, along the south fence line of her place, where the soil stays damp. No one's touched them in years. Wolfsbane can repel it, Old Man Weber said quietly. But there's only enough there to make smoke, not enough to keep it away from you. Godfrey nodded once. Good. We don't trust it to keep us safe, but to turn the creature where we want to go. He reached for a piece of charcoal and marked 4 small X's on Vogel's map. We don't charge the den, he said. That's how men die thinking they're brave. We apply pressure and force movement. We start a fire here. And here. He tapped the narrow, upwind approaches. We use green wood that will make thick smoke. We make it choose the smoke or this corridor. And when it does? Isaac Porter asked. Godfrey looked up at him, measuring. Then we use ground it can't swing in. Tight spaces, like a ravine or between thick trees. We don't run at it or face it in the open. Wilhelm Kramer shifted where he stood, axe resting against his shoulder. I've hunted bear in tighter places than that. Godfrey's eyes flicked to him. And bears run away when they bleed. The room sat in awkward silence for a moment. Matthias Braun, the blacksmith, cleared his throat. I've been able to melt down the silver pieces donated to get a few rounds, but not many. I prioritized making a bayonet for every man, though the silver is softer than steel and will break if we're not careful. Bayonets are for keeping it off you, Godfrey said. Not killing it alone. You stab, you step back. You don't hold. You don't wrestle. You don't prove anything. Thomas Reed swallowed. And if it breaks through the bayonets, then you fall back in pairs, Wright said, stepping in. No one runs blind. No one runs alone. Isaac Porter leaned forward, hand flattening on the map. If it turns south instead of north, we'll lose it in the low ground. Vogel nodded slowly. Unless we block it. Isaac met his gaze. We don't have the men. A beat. We do if the mill stays dark tomorrow, Isaac continued. Jacob can spare one day. Same with Pike the carpenter. Jacob Heller and Samuel Pike exchanged a glance, then nodded without ceremony. Godfrey watched that expression unreadable, then inclined his head once, approving. "Good," he said simply. "Old man," Weber spoke again, softer now. "It will not flee like an animal." "No," Vogel agreed. "It will defend that place." "And that," Godfrey said, "is what gets it killed." No one spoke for a moment. The weight of it settled, not fear, exactly, but acceptance. Wright broke the silence. "We move at first light." "And if it doesn't come out?" Thomas Reed asked. Godfrey's jaw tightened. "Then we wait. Hunger's already working for us." Grandmother Boslett rose slowly then, leaning on the back of the bench. She looked at the men, not as a group, but one by one. "Do this cleanly," she said, "or don't do it at all." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint, bitter edge of crushed leaves from somewhere down the road, where already some of the older women had begun gathering the abandoned plants that grew on the edge of the forest. Chapter 15. Goodbyes. Early morning, February 17th, 1864. Dawn came thin and colorless. A narrow band of light crept under low cloud, just enough to separate road from field, fence from frost-dark earth. Smoke rose from chimneys, more from habit than need, busy hands trying to reassure unsettled hearts. The men did not gather all at once. They came in pairs and singles, boots muffled by cold ground, rifles carried carefully, as though rough handling might offend them. Their silver bayonets were wrapped in cloth to protect the soft blade's edge. At the Porter house, Mrs. Porter stood on the stoop with her shawl pulled tight as her son prepared to leave. Isaac checked the strap of his pack twice, then once more, as if the act itself might settle him. "You don't need to walk us out," he said. She stepped down anyway, straightened his collar, smoothed it again when it didn't need it. "Eat when you stop," she said. "Not when you think you're finished." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once and turned back inside without another word. Isaac stood there a second longer before shouldering his rifle and moving on. At the smithy, Matthias Braun finished quenching the last bayonet. Steam curled up around his hands. He wiped them on his apron and untied it, folding it carefully and setting it on the bench. His wife held out the attachment for his rifle. "It fits," she said as he worked the metal over the barrel's mouth. He tested the catch once, then handed it back. "Wrap it again." She did. Their hands touched briefly in the exchange. Nothing more was said. In the tree line beyond the last row of houses, Wilhelm Kramer emerged with his axe bare, its edge newly honed. He paused at his door long enough to press his palm flat against the frame, then turned away. Thomas Reed, the teamster, waited in the road, shifting his weight. "You sure about that?" Thomas asked, nodding to the axe. Wilhelm smiled faintly. "It's what I know." At the mill, the wheel stood still, water slipping past unused. Jacob Heller closed the door and tested the latch twice. Samuel Pike, the carpenter, waited with his hands empty, tool belt left behind for the first time in years. "No boards today," Samuel said. Jacob shook his head. "No grain either." They joined the others without ceremony. Near the edge of town, Grandmother Boslett stood with a small bundle at her feet, wolfsbane branches bound with twine, leaves dark and heavy with scent. Anna Godfrey stood beside her, one hand resting lightly at her husband's back. John Godfrey leaned on his cane, wearing his freshly washed uniform coat, as though he was sending off an honor guard instead of his neighbors and friends. His face was drawn, but his eyes were clear. Isaac bent to lift the bundle. "Don't breathe it when it burns," Grandmother Boslett said. "And don't think it will save you if you stop moving." Isaac met her gaze. "We won't." She nodded, satisfied. Wright adjusted his rifle strap and turned to Godfrey. "You'll keep them safe?" he asked quietly. Godfrey nodded. "I'll have the old men on the ridge and the young on the mill road. We'll have fires ready if it comes this way. And we'll ring the bells to call you back if it comes to that. And if we don't get back in time, then we hold," Godfrey said, "like soldiers." Wright held his gaze a moment longer, then extended his hand. Godfrey took it, firm and brief. Anna said nothing. She only tightened her grip on her husband once, then let go. No bells rang. No prayers were spoken aloud as the group began walking away from town. Godfrey's voice carried after them, calm and certain. God be with you. The men turned north as the light finally strengthened enough to cast shadows, long, thin shapes stretching ahead of them down the road, overlapping until they became indistinguishable. They walked in silence as the road narrowed and the trees closed in. Only when the last house slipped from view did Wright speak. From here on, we keep to the plan. Behind them, the town about its day, unsure whether the night would bring their saviors or their bane. Chapter 16. The Approach. Mid-morning, February 17, 1864. They left the road before the sun cleared the trees. Vogel led them along a narrow cut where water had once run hard enough to leave a shallow scar in the earth. Grass had reclaimed most of it, but the ground still dipped just enough to keep their silhouettes low. He walked with the certainty of someone following memory rather than sight. His pace steady, never hurried. No one spoke. Rifles were carried low. Bayonets remained wrapped. Even Wilhelm's axe was slung across his back instead of carried in hand, its edge hidden. The woods changed as they climbed. The trees thinned first, then twisted. Old growth gave way to younger trunks bent by poor soil and wind. Moss thickened on the north sides of stones. The air grew cooler, damper. Somewhere far off, a crow called once, and then fell silent. Vogel raised a hand. They stopped as one. Ahead, the land dipped sharply, forming a shallow bowl choked with brush and fallen timber. Beyond it, the ground rose again toward the ridge where the cabin sat, still out of sight, but close enough now that Vogel did not need to look to know where it was. He turned, his voice barely more than breath. From here on, he said, we move like smoke. Wright nodded once. Isaac adjusted his grip on the wolfsbane bundle, without letting it rustle. They split as planned. Braun, Isaac, and Heller took the left, circling downslope where the ground was soft and would hold sound. Pike and Reed went right with Vogel, following a game trail that wound between low brush and stone. Wilhelm and Wright held the center, moving last, watching both flanks. It took time. More than any of them wanted. Fire, it turned out, required patience. They dug shallow pits rather than building stacks, just enough to hold heat without light. Wolfsbane was layered under damp leaves and green wood so that when it burned, it would smolder first, releasing its bitter scent before flame. Each man worked with bare hands or wrapped cloth, careful not to bruise the leaves more than necessary. No sparks. No struck steel. When the first pit was ready, Braun held the coal in his palm like a living thing while Isaac shielded it from the breeze. The fire caught reluctantly, a faint glow breathing under the leaves. They covered it again immediately. One by one, the others did the same. 3 fires. Then a fourth. They were nearly set when Wilhelm froze. He had been clearing brush with the careful confidence of long habit, moving as though the forest would yield if addressed properly. His hand paused mid-motion, fingers splayed. Wright followed his gaze. There, just upslope, a shape in the brush where brush should not be pressed flat. Something had moved there recently. Not now, not close, but close enough to matter. Wright raised 2 fingers. Hold. Vogel eased back toward them, reading the tension in their posture, without a word. He crouched, eyes narrowing as he studied the ground. It's still in the cabin, he murmured. Or near it. How can you tell? The teamster whispered, breath unsteady. Vogel pointed with the tip of his boot. No birds. And the wind's wrong. They waited. A minute passed. Then another. Somewhere higher on the ridge, which shifted. The low, complaining sound of something old settling under its own weight. No footsteps followed. No breath. No answering sound. Wright exhaled slowly through his nose. Next step, he said. The last fire was lit. This one closer. This one meant to be noticed. They withdrew as a group, easing back into the bowl below the ridge, taking positions behind stone and fallen timber. Rifles came up. Cloth was unwound from bayonets, silver catching the dull gray light without shining. No one spoke. They waited for smoke. It rose slowly at first, thin, reluctant threads curling through the trees. Then thicker, bitter. Wrong smelling, the kind of scent that clung to the back of the throat. A moment passed. Then, from above them, came the sound of something heavy shifting its weight. Not a roar, not a howl, just the unmistakable scrape of claw on wood. Wilhelm tightened his grip on the axe. Wright did not look at him. "Remember the plan," he said quietly. "Let it come to us." The smoke thickened, and somewhere on the ridge, the cabin began to be surrounded by smoke and stench. Chapter 17. First Contact. Late morning, February 6, 1864. The smoke reached the cabin before the men heard anything else. It crept through the broken boards and collapsed roof, thickening as it found places to cling. The wolfsbane burned low and bitter. It sent cutting through the clean dampness of the woods like rotting water. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the cabin answered. Wood groaned, not the slow complaint of age, but the sharp protest of weight shifting where weight should not be. A board snapped. Something inside dragged itself across the floor, heavy and uneven. Wright tightened his grip on the rifle. "Hold," he whispered. The sound stopped. Silence pressed down hard enough that the crackle of the fires seemed loud by comparison. Smoke pooled under the trees, drifting downslope exactly as planned. A shape appeared in the cabin doorway. It did not rush out. It crouched low, its bulk filling the frame, one shoulder higher than the other. One arm hung wrong, swollen, stiff, barely moving, while the other braced against the doorframe with claws that dug into it easily. Its head lifted. It did not look at the smoke. It looked downslope, at them. Wilhelm Kramer inhaled sharply. The thing moved. Not fast, not yet, but with the deliberate certainty of something that knew the ground beneath it. It stepped out of the cabin and angled sideways, favoring the injured arm, keeping the ridge at its back. Wright raised his hand. Now. The first shot cracked the air. Braun fired from the left, the report echoing off stone. The bullet struck high, tearing fur and flesh from the creature's shoulder. The wound burned slightly around the edges and emitted a slight tendril of black smoke. The creature recoiled with a sound like breath forced from ruined lungs. Not a howl, but pain mixed with rage. More shots followed. Reed fired too quickly, his shot wild. Heller's bullet struck low and kicked up a small spray of dirt. Smoke and powder layered over the wolfsbane haze, stinging eyes, clogging breath. The monster lurched forward, not toward the smoke, toward the men. "Fall back." Wright shouted. They moved as they had planned, or as close to it as fear allowed, retreating downslope toward the narrow ground Vogel had chosen. Rifles were worked, bayonets gleaming as powder and ball were reloaded. Except Wilhelm did not fall back. He stepped forward instead, grabbing his axe. It was instinct, the same instinct that had served him against bears and wild boar, the certainty that strength and steel and confidence could end a thing if applied hard enough. He brought the axe up two-handed, gray edge making a slight whoosh as he swung. The blow landed. It bit deep into the creature's side, drawing a wet, furious snarl, and blackened blood spilled over the blade. Wilhelm smiled. That was his mistake. The creature's good arm lashed out, faster than its bulk should have allowed. It caught the axe haft and wrenched, dragging Wilhelm forward off balance. Wilhelm tried to let go, but habit betrayed him. His grip tightened instead of released. The second strike came with the ruined arm. Not strong, not clean, but enough. Claws raked Wilhelm's chest and throat, and the force of it hurled him sideways into a nearby tree. He hit the ground hard and did not rise. "Wilhelm!" Isaac shouted. Wright fired again, point blank. The bullet tore through the creature's neck, again smoldering inside the creature's flesh, as a new burnt smell joined the burning wolfsbane. The monster staggered, half falling, then caught itself against a tree, leaving a smear of dark blood across the bark. It did not flee. It charged. The line broke. Braun's rifle misfired. A wet click instead of a report. He swore and drove forward instead, bayonet first. The silver blade sank into the creature's chest just under the ribs, deep enough that Braun leaned his weight into it, the bayonet disappearing in between burning flesh and fur. The creature roared then, a sound full of rage and memory and pain layered together. Braun tried to pull the bayonet free. It did not come. The creature seized the rifle, hauling Braun upwards with terrible strength. Braun's feet left the ground. His free hand scrabbled at the stock, at the bayonet, at anything. The silver blade continued to burn as the new angle tore down into the monster's waist. The creature shrieked and twisted the rifle free, still holding the blacksmith high in the air as he clung to the rifle. Braun's scream cut off abruptly as the creature crushed his shoulder and chest in its jaws and flung him aside like a broken toy. He landed near Wilhelm. Neither moved. Reed bolted. Not far, only a few steps, but enough. The creature turned, faster than the teamster despite its wounds, and struck him hard and down into the ground with its good hand. Thomas Reed crumpled under the blow, his leg folding beneath him at an angle no leg should bend. His scream split the air. "Stay together." Wright shouted. Vogel was already moving. He surged forward with Isaac at his side, Vogel's rifle empty, but bayonet ready. Vogel drove his blade into the creature's wounded side, aiming for where the ribs had already been broken by Braun's blow. The monster gurgled, but still managed to push its good arm forward towards Vogel's chest. Isaac brought his rifle up and fired point blank. The silver bullet punched through the creature's jaw and out the back of its skull. The thing convulsed. Vogel wrenched his bayonet free and thrust again, driving it into higher in between its ribs. The creature collapsed to one knee, clawing at the ground, breath hitching in ruined spasms. Wright advanced. He fixed his bayonet and plunged it down between the creature's shoulders, putting his weight behind it. The creature shuddered once, then stilled. For a moment, no one moved. Smoke drifted. Fires crackled softly. The woods seemed to hold its breath. Vogel staggered back. The old man was covered in sweat and dirt, his slender outline suddenly appearing very frail. He pressed a hand to his chest. Blood soaked through his fingers, dark and steady. "It's done," he said. His knees buckled. Wright caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him carefully. Vogel's breath came shallow now. He looked up at Wright, eyes clear for the first time since the fight began. "Should have finished it years ago," he murmured. Wright shook his head. "You finished it now." Vogel smiled faintly. Then his breath went out and did not return. The men stood among smoke and blood and silence, fewer than they had been when they came. And for the first time in a very long while, the ridge did not feel watched. Chapter 18. Aftermath. Late morning, February 17th, 1864. They did not cheer. No one spoke at all at first. The fires burned low, their work finished, and the smoke thinned until the cabin stood revealed again, just a ruin now, emptied of the thing that had claimed it. What remained on the ground between the trees was heavy, unmistakably dead, and already beginning to look less like a monster and more like a body that should not exist in the world at all. Wright was the first to move. He stepped back from Vogel's still form and closed the old man's eyes with 2 fingers, gentle as a benediction. For a moment he rested his hand there, then rose and looked around at what remained of the party. "Check the wounded," he said quietly. Isaac knelt beside Reed. The teamster's face was gray, sweat standing on his skin despite the cold. His leg lay twisted wrong, the boot pointing in a direction it should not. "Don't move," Isaac said, though Reed was already gripping his sleeve hard enough to bruise. "I can't feel it," Reed gasped. "I can't." "You can," Isaac said, firm now. "You're just scared." Reed nodded like a drowning man agreeing to breathe. They splinted the leg as best they could, using a rifle stock and torn cloth. Reed screamed once when they said it, then bit down hard on his own sleeve and made no further sound. Nearby, Jacob Heller and Samuel Pike stood over Braun and Wilhelm. There was nothing to be done. The woodsman lay where he had fallen, eyes open, one hand still clenched as though it remembered it should be holding an axe. If it wasn't for the red soaking his shirt and the unnatural bend in his back, it almost looked like he might rise and finish the job if given time enough. Braun lay on his back, one arm bent beneath him, the other flung wide. His rifle rested where it had been torn from his grasp, bayonet bent slightly at the base, silver edge dulled and blackened. Heller removed his hat. "So many years," he murmured, "and this is how it ends." Wright heard him, but did not answer. His attention was on the thing they had killed. Up close, it was worse. The fur lay patchy and uneven, burned and torn where silver had struck. When Wright flipped it over with his boot, its injured arm hung twisted and useless, and the chest caved inward around the wound's brawn, and Vogel had opened. Its head lolled at an angle that made the shape of its skull disturbingly clear. Canine, yes, but stretched too long. The jaw heavy, with teeth meant for tearing rather than killing cleanly. Wright crouched beside it and rested the tip of his bayonet against its neck. He pressed, hard enough to be certain. Nothing. No breath. No twitch. No waiting strength coiled beneath ruined flesh. "It's done," he said again, this time not to reassure anyone else, but himself. They worked then, because there was nothing else to do. They covered the bodies of the dead with coats, hoping that the bodies could be retrieved later for proper burial. The men doused the remaining fires, careful to scatter the ashes and stomp out every ember. The wolfsbane smoke lingered longest, bitter and clinging, as though reluctant to release its hold on the place. Isaac shouldered Braun's rifle without being asked. Heller took Wilhelm's axe and wrapped the blade in cloth before sticking it in his belt. Wright and Pike fashioned a stretcher for Reed, moving deliberately so as to not jar the twisted leg. Before they left, Wright turned back once more toward the cabin. It stood silent, roof sagging, doorway empty. Whatever memory had clung to it had died there with its last occupant. "Burn it," Isaac said quietly. Wright shook his head. "No." Isaac frowned. "Why not?" "Because it's finished," Wright said. "And because I don't want anyone forgetting what stood here." They left it standing. The return journey was slower. Reed faded in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow but steady. No one spoke unless necessary. The woods felt different now, not safe, but vacant, as though something vast had been removed and the land itself had not yet decided what to do with the space left behind. When the first fences came into view, Wright heard a shout from one of the figures on the ridge. "They're watching," Pike said. "Yes," Wright replied. "And they're waiting." At the edge of town, Godfrey stood with a cane in one hand and a rifle across his shoulder. Around him gathered the men too old, too young, or too necessary to have gone, faces drawn tight with expectation. Anna stood near the front. Her eyes went first to Isaac, then to the stretcher, then to the road behind them. She did not cry. She did not run. She closed her eyes once, briefly, and opened them again. Godfrey stepped forward, took an account without being told. "It's over," Wright said. Godfrey nodded. "And the cost?" Wright glanced back at the road behind them, at the men who did not walk it anymore. "We'll speak of it inside," he said. As they passed through the town, doors opened quietly. Hands reached out to steady Reed, to touch Isaac's sleeve, to retrieve the rifles and axe from weary shoulders. No one asked if it was true. They could see it in the way the men walked. The woods beyond the town did not stir. Chapter 19. What is remembered? Early afternoon, February 17th, 1864. Anna did not go home right away. She stood at the edge of the square while the men were taken inside, while Reed was carried to the doctor's house, and the new widows were gently escorted home by their families and neighbors. She watched hands move, practiced, gentle, careful not to hurry grief, and felt something inside her settle into a shape she did not yet have a name for. Someone rang the church bell once, just once. Not a call to gather, not an alarm, a mark set into the morning. Anna turned away before the sound finished fading. Inside her house, the kettle had gone cold. She set it back on the hearth and added wood, her movements steady, precise. Her hands did not shake. She noticed that distantly, as one notices weather. When the water began to heat, there was a knock at the door. Grandmother Boslett did not wait for an answer. She entered as she always had, leaning heavily on her cane, eyes sharp despite the long night. Mrs. Porter followed more slowly, wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of smoke and dried herbs. "You should sit," Porter said. Anna poured water into 3 cups instead. They sat at the table where Anna had mended shirts and written lists and counted out seed in quieter seasons. For a long moment, no one spoke. Steam curled upward, ghost thin. "It's finished," Anna said at last. Grandmother Boslett nodded. "That thing is." Mrs. Porter stirred her cup. "Others have been before. Others will be again." Anna looked at them, then really looked. These women had been old her entire life, fixtures like stone walls and trees that bent but did not fall. She understood, suddenly, what that endurance had cost. "No one taught me," Anna said. "Not properly." Grandmother Boslet's mouth tightened. "We taught what we could, without being told to stop." "And when we were told," Mrs. Porter added. Grandmother Boslet snorted softly. "What old Marta had could before our parents could shoo us away. Then we learned to remember quietly." Anna reached for the paper she had set aside earlier, clean, unmarked, meant for accounts or letters. She placed it between them. "Tell me," she said. They did. Not stories, not as such. There were no embellishments, no fireside flourishes. Just facts, laid down carefully. What wolfsbane did, and what it did not. How silver burned, and how it could fail if the hand wavered. How the smoke had to move downhill, never up. How wounds that should have killed a man did not kill that. "Most important," Grandmother Boslet said, tapping the table once hard, "is this: it was a man first." Mrs. Porter nodded. "They always are. Not that a woman can't. But they always start human on the outside." Anna wrote until her fingers ached. She wrote without judgment, without comfort. She wrote signs that could be missed, what changes could occur in a heart gone cold, silences that should never be ignored. They spoke of the hard lessons of the old country, both German and English, of how the monsters had followed them across the sea to their new home, of how hunger, injury, and isolation all made fertile ground for the worst of the human soul to grow. When the page filled, Anna turned it over and continued. "What do we tell them?" she asked finally. "The others. The town." Grandmother Boslet considered. "Enough." Mrs. Porter shook her head. "Tell them enough to recognize it, but not enough to teach someone how to change." Anna nodded. She had already known the answer. When the men returned later, Wright first, then Godfrey with his cane, then Isaac, pale and quiet, Anna listened from the corner of the room. She watched how their eyes avoided the window that looked north. When Wright spoke of vigilance, Grandmother Boslet spoke of record. When Godfrey spoke of watch rotations, Anna spoke of signs that should not be ignored. When Isaac faltered, Mrs. Porter reached for his hand and held it until his breathing steadied. No one argued. That surprised Anna. That night, when the house was quiet again, Anna wrapped the pages carefully in cloth and placed them in the bottom of the chest beneath the stairs, not hidden, but not displayed. Before she closed it, Anna added one more line to the last page. "Do not wait for certainty." She added Grandmother Boslet's bundle of dried leaves to the side of the pages. The forgotten plants by the fence would soon be cared for again. She wrote a note to put the inside of the chest on top of the bundle, so that memory never fails. Outside, the woods lay still, not peaceful, but empty. Anna extinguished the lamp and went to bed beside her husband, knowing sleep would not come easily, and knowing, too, that if it did not, she would endure. She always had.